The fastest way to discover what your family truly thinks of you is to tell them no for the first time. I did not know that yet when I walked into my parents' backyard on a warm Saturday afternoon. The party was supposed to be simple. My mother had invited everyone over for what she called a special family gathering. There were balloons tied to the fence, folding tables covered with food, and children running across the lawn while adults laughed beneath large patio umbrellas. At first, nothing seemed unusual. My brother Jason stood near the grill talking with our father. His wife Rachel was smiling beside him. Their 4 children chased each other through the grass while relatives filled paper plates and exchanged stories. I remember thinking how relaxed everyone looked. I had just finished a demanding week as a marketing director, and for the first time in months, I was looking forward to doing absolutely nothing. I grabbed a drink, found an empty chair, and settled in. Then my mother tapped her glass with a spoon. The familiar sound immediately drew everyone's attention. Conversation stopped. Children wandered closer. Jason wrapped an arm around Rachel's shoulders and exchanged a grin with her. "We have some exciting news," my mother announced. The crowd immediately began smiling. Someone shouted that Rachel looked happy enough to be expecting another baby. Everyone laughed. Rachel blushed. Jason raised his hand dramatically. "Actually," he said, "that is exactly what we wanted to tell everyone." The backyard exploded with cheers. My father clapped loudly. My mother nearly jumped out of her seat. Several relatives rushed forward to hug them. Even I smiled. A 5th child was certainly a surprise, but Jason and Rachel loved being parents. Their children were healthy and happy. For a few moments, I joined everyone else in celebrating. Then I noticed something strange. My mother kept glancing in my direction. So did my father. The look was familiar. I had seen it many times before. It was the look they exchanged whenever they had already made a decision involving me. A small knot formed in my stomach. Jason continued thanking everyone for their support. Rachel talked about how excited the children were. More congratulations followed. Then, just as the excitement began settling down, my mother stood up again. And thankfully, she announced with a bright smile, "We already know who is going to help with the baby." Several relatives nodded approvingly. I frowned. Jason looked confused for a second. Rachel looked surprised. Before anyone could ask a question, my mother pointed directly at me. "Emily has always been wonderful with the kids," she said proudly. "She already spends so much time helping. We all know she will be there for this baby too." Laughter and applause broke out around the yard. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood what she meant. Then my father joined in. "It works out perfectly," he said. "Emily has always been the reliable one." More nods. More smiles. More approval. My aunt commented that Jason and Rachel were lucky to have a sister like me. Someone else joked that I practically deserved honorary parent status by now. The conversation moved forward as though a decision had already been finalized. Nobody asked what I thought. Nobody asked whether I had plans. Nobody asked whether I even wanted that responsibility. I sat there holding my drink while the people around me casually discussed months of my future, as though I were not sitting 10 feet away. The strangest part was that nobody seemed to find anything unusual about it. Everyone smiled. Everyone celebrated. Everyone acted as though volunteering my time, my energy, and my life was the most natural thing in the world. And while the entire backyard applauded, I realized something that made my stomach sink. I was the only person at that party who had not agreed to any of it. For several seconds, I sat there wondering if anyone would realize how strange the situation was. Nobody did. The conversation continued as though my future had just been successfully organized. My mother was already discussing schedules. My father was talking about how much easier things would be with family helping. A cousin joked that I should start clearing space in my calendar. Everyone laughed. I forced a smile, but inside, Something felt very wrong. What made it worse was that Jason and Rachel did not immediately correct anyone. They looked surprised, certainly, but they also looked relieved. I could not entirely blame them. Raising 4 children was already exhausting. A 5th child meant more expenses, more responsibilities, and less sleep. The idea of having free help must have sounded appealing. The problem was that nobody had actually asked me. Eventually, the gathering returned to normal. People drifted back toward the food tables. Children resumed playing in the yard. Music started again through a portable speaker. Yet the comments kept coming. Every few minutes, another relative stopped to congratulate me on becoming such an important part of the baby's future. One aunt told me how lucky Jason was to have a sister willing to sacrifice so much. Another relative praised my generosity. The strange part was that I had never agreed to anything. They were congratulating a version of me that existed only inside their assumptions. I finally found a moment alone near the back fence and tried to collect my thoughts. Unfortunately, that lasted less than a minute. My mother appeared beside me carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. "There you are," she said cheerfully. "I knew you would be excited once the surprise settled in." Excited about what? She laughed as though I had made a joke. Helping with the baby, of course. The confidence in her voice caught me off guard. There was not even a hint of uncertainty. She truly believed the matter had already been decided. "Mom," I said carefully. "Nobody asked me." Her smile faded slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly that. Nobody asked me." She looked confused. "Emily, it is family." There it was. The phrase I had heard my entire life. 2 simple words that somehow transformed obligations into expectations. Family. Whenever Jason needed help moving, it was family. Whenever someone needed last-minute childcare, it was family. Whenever a holiday meal required preparation, cleanup, or organization, it was family. Somehow that word always seemed to point in my direction. "I have a career," I reminded her. "I know that. I work long hours." "Everyone works." "I travel for work." "You always figure things out." Her answers arrived so quickly that it became obvious she had already considered every possible concern and dismissed each one before speaking to me. My availability was not part of the calculation. My goals were not part of the calculation. My life was not part of the calculation. "Mom," I said again, "why would you announce something like that without talking to me first?" She looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Because you always help." I stood there silently. The answer explained everything. Not because it was reasonable, because it revealed the pattern. For years, I had stepped in whenever the family needed support. I watched the kids. I picked them up from activities. I canceled plans when emergencies happened. I filled gaps, solved problems, helped whenever asked. Somewhere along the way, helping stopped being appreciated and started becoming expected. My willingness had quietly transformed into an obligation. Across the yard, I watched Jason laughing with relatives while Rachel spoke with friends. Nobody looked malicious. Nobody looked cruel. That was what made the situation so difficult. They were not trying to hurt me. They simply believed my life existed as a backup plan for theirs. And standing there beside the fence, listening to my mother casually explain why she volunteered my future, I began realizing that this problem was much older than one unexpected pregnancy. Driving home that evening, I could not stop thinking about my mother's answer. "Because you always help." The words repeated in my mind the entire way back to my apartment. By the time I parked in my building's garage, I realized what bothered me most was not the assumption itself. It was how familiar it felt. This was not a new situation. It was simply the latest version of a pattern that had existed for as long as I could remember. Growing up, Jason was always the center of attention. He was charming, outgoing, and naturally confident. Teachers loved him. Coaches praised him. Relatives talked about his potential at every family gathering. I was not ignored exactly, but I occupied a different role. Wow. Jason received encouragement, I received responsibility. If guests were coming over, I helped prepare the house. If something needed organizing, I handled it. If our parents needed assistance, they called me. At the time, I accepted it because families are supposed to help each other. The problem was that helping gradually became expected rather than appreciated. When Jason left college and needed money after making several poor financial decisions, my parents stepped in immediately. When I graduated and rented my first apartment, I was congratulated for being independent. When Jason and Rachel had their first child, I happily volunteered to babysit occasionally. Then occasionally became frequently. Frequently became routinely. Before long, I was spending entire weekends helping with childcare. If a sitter canceled, my phone rang. If someone got sick, my phone rang. If Jason and Rachel wanted a night out, my phone rang. Looking back, I realized there was always an assumption hidden beneath every request. Emily will figure it out. Emily will make time. Emily will help. The strange thing was that nobody ever demanded it aggressively. That would have been easier to recognize. Instead, it arrived wrapped in compliments. They called me dependable. They called me generous. They called me selfless. Those words sounded positive, but they slowly trapped me inside a role I never consciously chose. A few days after the party, I met my friend Sarah for coffee before work. Sarah had known me for nearly 10 years. If anyone could recognize when something was bothering me, it was her. The moment I sat down, she narrowed her eyes. "What happened?" she asked. I laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" "Very." So I told her everything. The pregnancy announcement, my mother's speech, the applause, the childcare plans that somehow included me without my knowledge. Sarah listened without interrupting. When I finished, she stirred her coffee and asked a question nobody in my family had bothered asking. "What do you want?" The simplicity of the question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what do you want, Emily?" she repeated. "Not what your parents want. Not what your brother wants. What do you want?" I opened my mouth and then stopped. Embarrassingly, I did not have an immediate answer. I was so used to reacting to everyone else's needs that I had not spent much time considering my own. Sarah smiled knowingly. "That tells me everything." "What does it tell you?" "It tells me that everyone around you has been making plans for your life for so long that you forgot you were allowed to make them too." Her words stayed with me long after we left the coffee shop. That afternoon, I looked at my calendar at work. Several business trips were scheduled over the next 6 months. A promotion opportunity was approaching. I had professional goals I cared about. Personal goals, too. Yet somehow my family had discussed none of them before volunteering me for a commitment that could consume years of my life. And for the first time, instead of feeling guilty about that realization, I felt something else. I felt angry. Not explosive anger. Not dramatic anger. Just a quiet growing awareness that maybe the biggest problem was not what my family expected from me. Maybe the biggest problem was how long I had allowed those expectations to continue. Over the next 2 weeks, something became impossible to ignore. My family had already started organizing my future without including me in a single conversation. The first sign came on a Tuesday evening when Rachel called. At first, I assumed she wanted to talk about the pregnancy. Instead, she immediately began discussing childcare schedules. "We were thinking Mondays and Wednesdays would probably work best," she said. I nearly dropped my phone. "What would work best?" There was a brief pause. "For when the baby arrives." The casual certainty in her voice stopped me cold. She was not asking. She was planning. "Rachel," I said carefully, "nobody has talked to me about any schedule." Another pause followed. Oh. Then she laughed softly. I just assumed Mom already worked everything out. That sentence stayed with me long after the call ended. Worked everything out. As though I were a calendar appointment instead of a person. A few days later, things became even stranger. My mother invited me over for dinner. When I arrived, several sheets of paper were spread across her kitchen table. At first, I thought she was organizing a vacation or budgeting for a home project. Then I saw my name, written multiple times, next to different days of the week. I stared at the papers. What is this? My mother looked up and smiled, just trying to make things easier for everyone. I picked up one of the pages. It was a childcare schedule, not a proposed schedule, not a draft. A completed schedule. My work travel dates had been marked. My weekends had been assigned. Even several vacation days I had planned months earlier were listed with notes suggesting alternative arrangements. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. You made this? I asked. Your father helped. She sounded proud of it. Proud. As though she had solved a complicated problem. The fact that the problem involved my life apparently never crossed her mind. Mom, why is my vacation on here? Well, we figured you could move it. Move it. The baby will need support. I looked around the kitchen wondering if anyone else understood how absurd this sounded. My mother continued talking about logistics while I stood there holding pages filled with plans I had never approved. The conversation felt surreal. Every sentence revealed another assumption. Every explanation uncovered another decision made on my behalf. By the time I left that evening, I realized the situation was far worse than I originally thought. This was not a spontaneous comment made during a family celebration. This was an entire system of expectations built without my knowledge. The following weekend provided even more evidence. I attended my niece's soccer game and arrived a few minutes before kickoff. As I walked toward the field, I overheard my father talking to another relative. Thankfully, Emily will be helping after the baby comes, he said. Otherwise, I do not know what Jason and Rachel would do. The relative nodded sympathetically. It is wonderful she is willing to make those sacrifices. I stopped walking. Willing. There was that word again. Everyone kept describing choices I had never made. For years, I had assumed my family simply appreciated my reliability. Now I was beginning to understand something uncomfortable. They were not appreciating it. They were budgeting around it, planning around it, depending on it. My availability had become part of their expectations. My time had become part of their resources. That realization changed everything. Because once I saw the pattern clearly, I could no longer pretend it was accidental. They had already built an entire future around the assumption that I would once again rearrange my life to solve problems that were not mine. And for the first time in my life, I found myself wondering what would happen if I refused. The question followed me everywhere after that. What would happen if I refused? For most people, saying no would have been a simple decision. For me, it felt enormous. Not because I doubted my right to make it, but because I knew exactly how my family would react. They had spent years building an image of me as the dependable daughter, the helpful sister, the person who could always be counted on. The moment I stepped outside that role, everything would change. A few days later, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. I was sitting in my office reviewing a proposal for a major client when my phone buzzed. It was a group message from my mother. Attached was an updated childcare schedule. My name appeared throughout the document. Mondays, Wednesdays, alternate weekends, holiday coverage, emergency backup days. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Nobody had spoken to me. Nobody had asked whether I was available. Yet there it was, an entire section of my future already assigned. What shocked me most was not the schedule itself. It was how naturally everyone treated it. Within minutes, replies began appearing. My father praised the organization. An aunt commented that it looked perfect. Jason thanked everyone for helping. Rachel added several heart emojis. Not a single person questioned whether I had agreed. Not one. I set my phone down and tried to focus on work, but my concentration was gone. Sarah's question returned to me. What do you want? For the first time, I forced myself to answer honestly. I wanted to continue growing my career. I wanted to accept the promotion opportunity my company was discussing. I wanted to travel. I wanted weekends that belonged to me. I wanted the freedom to make decisions about my own life without feeling guilty. None of those desires seemed unreasonable. Yet somehow, inside my family, they felt almost selfish. That realization bothered me more than anything else. Later that evening, I met with my supervisor to discuss an upcoming leadership program. The opportunity would require occasional travel and additional responsibilities. Under normal circumstances, I would have been excited. Instead, I found myself wondering how my family would react. The fact that I even considered their reaction made me uncomfortable. Why was I evaluating my professional future through the lens of someone else's childcare plans? The answer arrived immediately, because that was what I had always done. Their priorities first, mine second. As I drove home that night, my phone rang again. This time it was Jason. Hey, he said cheerfully. Mom showed us the schedule. It looks like this is really going to work. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. What is going to work? The childcare plan. He sounded genuinely relieved. Rachel feels so much better knowing we have support. Support. Another interesting word. Nobody called it responsibility. Nobody called it obligation. They called it support because that sounded kinder. Jason, I said carefully, did it ever occur to you to ask me? Silence followed. Only a few seconds, but enough to tell me everything. Ask you what? He finally replied. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was revealing. He honestly did not understand the question. In his mind, the decision had already been made. Ask whether I wanted to do any of this. Another pause. Emily, you always help. There it was again. The sentence that had become the foundation of every expectation. I ended the call politely, but afterward I sat in my apartment for nearly an hour thinking about those 3 words. You always help. Not once did anyone say you always choose to help. The choice had disappeared.
Somewhere over the years, my
family stopped seeing my generosity as a gift and started seeing it as a guarantee. And sitting alone in my living room that evening, I realized something important. If I wanted my life back, eventually I was going to have to disappoint people who had become far too comfortable making decisions for me. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. 2 weeks later, my parents invited everyone to Sunday dinner. Normally, I would have declined. Work had been exhausting, and I still felt frustrated about everything that had happened. But something told me this conversation was coming whether I attended or not. I might as well face it directly. The moment I walked into the house, I knew I was right. Papers covered part of the dining room table. Rachel sat beside my mother reviewing what looked suspiciously like another childcare plan. My father was discussing future expenses with Jason. Nobody appeared concerned. Nobody looked uncertain. They all behaved like people whose plans were moving forward exactly as expected. Then my mother spotted me. Perfect, she said brightly. We were just talking about next spring. I set my purse down slowly. Were you? The baby should arrive by then, Rachel added with a smile. We're trying to coordinate everyone's schedules. Everyone's schedules. Once again, my future was apparently a group project. I sat down and listened. For nearly 15 minutes, they discussed arrangements, school pickups, work shifts, and family availability. My name appeared constantly. Emily can handle that day. Emily can cover that weekend. Emily can help after work. It was almost impressive. They managed to build an entire support system around me without ever speaking to me directly. Finally, my mother pushed a folder toward me. "Take a look and tell us if we missed anything." I opened it. My stomach tightened. There it was. An organized calendar stretching months into the future. Certain weekdays had already been assigned to me. Several weekends were blocked off. Even holidays contained notes about possible childcare coverage. I closed the folder. The room continued talking. Nobody noticed. Nobody realized something had changed. For years, this was where I would have smiled politely. I would have adjusted my schedule. I would have convinced myself it was easier to help than create conflict. But Sarah's question still echoed in my mind. "What do you want?" For the first time, I knew the answer. I wanted my own life. My mother finally looked at me. "Well," she asked, "does everything look okay?" The room grew quiet. Jason stopped talking. Rachel looked up. My father folded his hands. They were all waiting for approval. They believed this was a routine formality, a box to check before moving forward. I took a slow breath. No. The words sounded surprisingly calm. Not angry. Not emotional. Just clear. For a moment, nobody reacted. My mother blinked.
No. No, Irapa.
"It does not look okay." Confusion spread across several faces. My father frowned slightly. "What exactly is the problem?" I looked around the table. "The problem is that all of you created a plan for my life without asking whether I wanted any part of it." Silence followed. Real silence. Not the comfortable kind. The uncomfortable kind that appears when people hear something they did not expect. My mother laughed nervously. "Emily, nobody is forcing you to do anything." I almost smiled at the irony. Then why is my schedule already filled out? Nobody answered. Jason shifted in his chair. Rachel looked down at the table. My father cleared his throat. For the first time since the pregnancy announcement, uncertainty entered the room. They had expected discussion, adjustments, negotiation. What they had not expected was refusal. My heart was pounding, but my voice remained steady. "I am happy for you," I told Jason and Rachel. "I truly am. But I am not agreeing to become a regular caregiver." The words landed with a weight I could almost feel. Years of expectations suddenly collided with a single sentence. And judging by the expressions around the table, nobody had prepared for what came after a simple no. The silence after my refusal lasted only a few seconds, but it felt much longer. Everyone at the table looked at me as though I had suddenly started speaking a different language. My mother recovered first. "Emily," she said carefully, "I do not think you understand." I almost laughed.
No, Mom.
"I understand perfectly." Her expression tightened. "Family helps family." There it was again. The phrase that appeared whenever someone wanted something from me. This time, however, it no longer carried the same power. "Family also asks before making decisions for other people," I replied. My father leaned forward. "Nobody made a decision for you." I looked down at the folder filled with schedules and assignments. "Then what is this?" He opened his mouth and then closed it again. Across the table, Jason finally spoke. "Emily, nobody is trying to take advantage of you." The words sounded sincere. That was the frustrating part. I honestly believed he meant them. "Jason," I said, "you already planned months of childcare around my availability. Because you have always helped." The familiar answer immediately appeared. It was becoming clear that everyone in the room was working from the same assumption. My past kindness had somehow become permanent consent. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "We thought you would want to be involved." Being involved and becoming a regular caregiver are two very different things. Rachel looked down at the table. For a moment, I felt bad for her. Unlike my parents, She seemed to realize the conversation was not going the way she expected. Then my mother sighed dramatically. I just cannot believe this is becoming such a big issue. That sentence changed something inside me. Not because it was cruel, because it was dismissive. The issue was only small if my life did not matter. It is a big issue to me, I said. I have my own responsibilities, my own plans, my own goals. My mother shook her head. Nobody is asking you to give up your life. I stared at her in disbelief. You literally scheduled my life. Another uncomfortable silence followed. My father rubbed his forehead. Jason looked frustrated. Rachel looked trapped between loyalty and common sense. Then came the part one should have expected.
Guilt.
It arrived slowly at first. My mother talked about how hard parenting 5 children would be. My father discussed the importance of supporting family during difficult times. An aunt who had been listening from the kitchen wandered into the dining room and mentioned how much she admired people willing to sacrifice for loved ones. Every comment pointed in the same direction. Nobody directly called me selfish. They did not have to. The implication hung in the air. If I truly loved my family, I would do this. If I truly cared, I would make it work. For years, those arguments would have succeeded. This time, they only made the situation clearer. Nobody was talking about what I wanted. Nobody was asking what I needed. The entire conversation revolved around everyone else's expectations. Finally, I pushed the folder back across the table. I love all of you, I said. That is not changing. Several faces softened slightly. Then I continued. But loving you does not mean surrendering control of my life. The room grew quiet again. Real quiet. Not shocked quiet this time. Thoughtful quiet. I could see people processing the difference. I will still be an aunt, I said. I will still spend time with the kids. I will still show up for important moments. But I am not agreeing to a permanent childcare schedule. My father looked disappointed. My mother looked hurt. Jason looked confused. Yet beneath all those reactions, I noticed something else. Nobody had an actual response to what I said. Because for the first time, I was not arguing. I was not defending myself. I was simply stating a boundary. And deep down, I think they all knew the difference. The conversation eventually moved on, but the atmosphere never recovered. As dinner ended and people began leaving, I could feel the shift. The family was no longer reacting to the pregnancy announcement. They were reacting to something far more unexpected. For the first time in my life, I had refused the role they assigned to me. And judging by the expressions I saw as I walked out the door, the real conflict was only beginning. The fallout arrived exactly the way I expected. Not immediately. Not dramatically. It came through phone calls, messages, and conversations that all carried the same underlying theme. Over the next several days, relatives who had remained silent during dinner suddenly developed strong opinions about my decision. An aunt called to tell me that family support was more important than personal convenience. A cousin suggested I might regret creating distance with people who cared about me. Even a family friend somehow heard about the situation and commented that it was unfortunate when modern careers became more important than family obligations. Every conversation sounded different on the surface, but the message underneath never changed. I was disappointing people. Strangely, the more those conversations happened, the calmer I became. For years, guilt had been my automatic response whenever someone questioned my choices. This time, something felt different. The arguments only confirmed what I had already realized. Nobody was upset because I had done something wrong. They were upset because I had changed a pattern that benefited them. The most difficult conversation happened a week later when Jason asked if we could meet for lunch. Part of me considered declining, but I knew avoiding the discussion would not solve anything. We met at a small restaurant near his office. At first, The conversation stayed casual. Work, the kids, the pregnancy. Then eventually Jason set down his drink and looked directly at me. I do not understand why this became such a big deal. I nodded slowly. I know you do not. We never expected you to raise the baby. That is not the point. Then what is? I took a deep breath. The point is that everyone planned my involvement before talking to me. Jason frowned. Mom was only trying to help. Help who? He hesitated. That hesitation mattered. For the first time, he seemed to genuinely consider the question. Rachel and me, he admitted. Exactly. We sat quietly for a moment. Then I said something I had never expressed out loud before. Jason, do you know how many weekends I have canceled plans because someone needed me? He looked surprised. I do not know. Do you know how many vacations I shortened? How many late-night calls I answered? How many times I rearranged work commitments? He shook his head. No, neither do I anymore. The words hung between us. I was not angry. I was tired. Tired of pretending that years of sacrifice had no cost. Tired of acting like my time existed in unlimited supply. Jason looked down at the table. I never thought about it that way. For the first time in weeks, I believed someone was actually listening. That is the problem, I said gently. Nobody did. The conversation lasted another hour. By the end, Jason was quieter than when he arrived. Not defensive, thoughtful. As we stood to leave, he said something unexpected. I think Mom and Dad got so used to depending on you that they stopped noticing how much they were asking. I smiled sadly. I think so too. A few days later, my mother called. Unlike previous conversations, her voice sounded different. Less certain. Less convinced she was right. We talked for nearly 40 minutes. For most of the call, she listened. Really listened. I explained things I had never explained before. The pressure. The expectations. The feeling that my goals always ranked behind someone else's needs. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said something I had been waiting years to hear. I did not realize you felt that way. The statement did not solve everything. It did not erase the past. But it mattered. Because for the first time, the conversation was no longer about childcare. It was about the truth. And after spending so many years staying silent, finally speaking honestly felt like the beginning of something much bigger than a single disagreement. 3 months later, the baby arrived healthy and surrounded by love. I visited the hospital a few days after the birth, carrying a small gift and a card. Rachel looked exhausted but happy. Jason smiled the moment he saw me. The room felt different than it had during those difficult weeks. Lighter. Calmer. More honest. I spent time meeting my newest niece, talking with the children, and celebrating with the family. Then I went home. Nobody handed me a schedule. Nobody discussed childcare assignments. Nobody volunteered my future. It was a simple moment, but it meant everything. Over the following months, something unexpected happened. The world did not fall apart. Jason and Rachel figured things out. They adjusted their routines, hired help when necessary, and leaned on support that had been freely offered rather than automatically expected. My parents gradually adapted as well. The change was not immediate. There were occasional comments, occasional reminders of old habits. But whenever those moments appeared, I calmly reinforced the same boundary. And each time, it became easier. Meanwhile, my own life continued moving forward. I accepted the leadership program at work. The promotion followed several months later. For the first time in years, I stopped feeling guilty about investing energy into my own future. I traveled for projects without worrying about who expected me to cancel. I planned weekends without assuming they would eventually belong to someone else. The strange thing was that I did not feel less connected to my family. In many ways, I felt closer to them. The resentment that had quietly accumulated over the years began fading. Once I stopped carrying responsibilities that were never mine to begin with, I actually enjoyed the time we spent together. One evening, nearly a year after that family gathering, my mother invited me over for dinner. As we cleaned dishes afterward, she stood beside me at the sink and spoke softly. "I owe you an apology." I looked at her in surprise. She dried her hands on a towel and continued. "For a long time, I thought depending on you was a compliment. I thought it meant we trusted you." She paused. "I did not realize we had stopped respecting your choices." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I smiled. "Thank you." She nodded. "You were right to say no." Hearing those words felt strangely emotional. Not because I needed validation, because it confirmed something important. Boundaries had not damaged the relationship. Honesty had improved it. Later that night, I sat alone on my apartment balcony watching city lights flicker in the distance. I thought about the person I had been before all of this happened. The woman who automatically rearranged her life whenever someone else had a need. The woman who believed keeping everyone happy was her responsibility. I understood her. She had good intentions, but she had forgotten something essential. Helping people should be a choice, not an obligation. Love should be freely given, not automatically assigned. Family should be built on respect, not expectation. Looking back, the most important thing I gained was not extra time or career opportunities. It was permission. Permission to value my own goals. Permission to make my own decisions. Permission to understand that saying no to one responsibility did not mean saying no to the people I loved. Sometimes the healthiest thing a person can do is disappoint others long enough for them to learn that your life belongs to you. My family eventually learned that lesson. More importantly, so did I. And as I sat there enjoying the quiet evening air, I realized something that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. For the first time in my adult life, the future in front of me was actually my own.